Deep Dive Podcast by the Boca Raton Tribune.
Okay, picture this. It's September 26th, 2025, and you've got these scenes unfolding pretty much at the same time across major U.S. cities, New York, Chicago, the Boston area. We're talking federal agents, tactical gear, tear gas, flashbangs, less lethal rounds, just real unrest. So today we're going to do a deep dive into that specific day, looking at the immigration enforcement climate. We're using Reuters reporting, which was picked up by places like the Boca Raton Tribune. And it really paints a picture of some aggressive ICE tactics, immigration and customs enforcement, and frankly, the chaos that followed in some communities.
Yeah, our goal here really is to unpack what was going on. The tension was obviously incredibly high. We need to look at some specific incidents there. Was that woman detained who turned out to be a legal resident,
Right.
some really violent clashes with protesters, and also try to understand the different viewpoints, on the enforcement itself and who's accountable when things go wrong.
And it's crucial, I think, to remember the backdrop here. The sources are clear. This was happening just days after that shooting at an ICE facility down in Dallas. That incident left one detainee dead, two others seriously hurt. So that attack was definitely hanging over everything, fueling the fear and maybe some of the aggression we saw from both sides. Okay, so let's get into it. Maybe start with what happened near Boston in Chelsea, Massachusetts. This incident seems particularly jarring. And it wasn't just ICE, right? The reports mention U.S. Marshals, FBI, Homeland Security investigations, HSI agents, all involved in this immigration raid.
That's immediately striking, isn't it? The sheer number of federal agencies involved. It makes you wonder, was this a particularly high priority target they were after, or was it more about showing force, using all available resources for these kinds of crackdowns? It suggests a major mobilization.
Yeah, it definitely raises questions about sort of the scope of the mission. The person at the center of this, identified only as Hilda, she was just accompanying a family member to a court hearing. We have an account from Milagros Barretos. She's a worker advocate with a group called La Colaborativa. And her description is pretty harrowing.
Right. Breno said ICE officers stopped their pickup truck and then apparently immediately smashed two of the windows. That detail, smashing windows, it sounds excessive right off the bat. Then they reportedly threw the woman, who is Guatemalan, to the ground.
It's a powerful image from the sources. Hilda pinned down, agents on top of her, and her young son just standing nearby, crying. Can only imagine how terrifying that must have been. She ended up going to the hospital afterwards. Shoulder scratch aggravated an old back injury.
And here's the absolute kicker. The thing that makes this incident stand out so starkly, Hilda was released right there, on the scene.
Why?
Because, according to the advocate, she's a permanent resident, a reported legal U.S. resident. So you have this level of force, the smashed windows, the physical takedown used on someone legally entitled to be here who was just helping a relative.
And that really played into the narrative advocates like Barreto were pushing. Barreto, who's a U.S. citizen herself, is quoted directly in the reporting saying, and this is her quote, "If you look like a Latino, you're a target."
Exactly. Chelsea is almost a perfect case study of the disconnect between, let's say, the stated policy and what was happening on the ground. The Trump administration always said the focus was on criminals, on public safety threats. But the reporting at the time, including for these operations, consistently pointed out that many people being arrested didn't have criminal records. And here, with Hilda, you see someone legally present being treated apparently as an immediate threat. Based on what? Her appearance, who she was with. It's deeply concerning.
Okay, so that's an individual case. Incredibly disturbing. But let's shift now to how communities were reacting, the broader resistance. Specifically, let's look at Chicago, or rather, the suburb of Broadview, Illinois. There are reports of really dramatic, violent confrontations outside an immigration detention center there. The scene described in Broadview sounds almost like a conflict zone. DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, their components on site, they used a whole range of crowd control measures. Tear gas, yes, but also less lethal rounds, flashbang grenades, pepper balls, quite an arsenal.
And the scale of it is important. The reporting mentions heavily armed ICE agents actually pacing on the rooftop of the detention center, firing volleys of pepper balls down at the protesters below who were chanting and holding signs. It definitely suggests the agents felt under siege, likely influenced by that Dallas shooting context we mentioned. But the response visually seems disproportionate to what advocates described.
And that's the core issue here, isn't it? The wildly different perceptions of what actually happened. You have Reverend Beth Brown, a pastor from Lincoln Park Presbyterian Church, quoted saying people were just peacefully standing behind the fence. She claimed the pepper balls were fired for absolutely no reason. Just indiscriminate in her view.
But then you look at the official DHS statement. Completely different story. They claimed over 200 rioters were blocking access to one gate, and that about 30 people actually swarmed another gate trying to break into the property. Rioters versus peaceful protesters. It's incredibly hard to know the objective truth when the accounts are just polar opposites like that.
And you have to remember the context in Chicago specifically that week, too. It wasn't just this protest. The sources mentioned that the funeral was being arranged for Silverio Villegas Gonzalez back in Michoacan, Mexico. He was the man who had been shot and killed by an ICE agent in another Chicago suburb just earlier that month. That incident was still incredibly raw.
That background is absolutely vital because trust was already broken. In the Villegas Gonzalez case, the agent claimed self-defense, fearing for his life. But then there were reports about body cam footage allegedly showing the agent downplaying his own injuries, calling them nothing major. So in that atmosphere, even a peaceful protest might feel threatening to agents on edge. And any use of force, from the protesters' perspective, would feel completely unjustified. It's a recipe for volatility.
Right. Let's connect this theme of force and accountability now to New York City.
Yeah.
Because there was an incident there that actually resulted in a, well, somewhat surprising administrative response. This happened inside a courthouse hallway. There's video shared by ProPublica showing an officer charging at a woman, Monica Moreta Galarza. She was an asylum seeker from Ecuador, apparently begging officers not to take her husband away.
And the key thing here is that the incident was caught on camera and seemed pretty clear-cut, which led to Tricia McLaughlin, a DHS spokesperson, making a public statement. She called the officer's conduct unacceptable.
That's strong language.
It is. And she announced the officer was relieved of current duties while they investigated. The reporting called this a rare Trump-era rebuke of ICE actions.
So why was it so rare? That seems like the obvious next question.
Well, the source material gives us context on that, too. It points out that earlier in the administration, DHS had significantly weakened its own internal oversight mechanisms. Specifically, the office responsible for investigating civil rights complaints against personnel had been essentially gutted as part of broader cuts.
Okay. So the usual channels for dealing with something like this weren't really functioning at full strength.
Pretty much. When you reduce the power and resources of your internal watchdogs, fewer incidents are likely to be investigated thoroughly, let alone lead to public rebukes or consequences. So that statement about the officer in New York was notable because it was an exception, not the rule, during that period.
Okay, so we've seen force against individuals like Hilda, clashes with protesters in Chicago, this rare accountability moment in New York. What about the bigger picture? Was there pushback happening at a policy or legal level against these kinds of aggressive tactics?
Yes, definitely.
The sources mention political reactions. For example, out in California, Governor Gavin Newsom, who was a prominent Democratic critic of the administration's policies, he signed a state law specifically to prevent ICE officers from wearing masks to hide their identities during enforcement actions.
Right. The argument from critics was straightforward. Masks prevent accountability. How can citizens report misconduct if they can't identify the officers involved? Especially when, as we saw in Chelsea, legally present people might get caught up in things.
Makes sense. But what was the administration's response to that?
Their counter-argument was also pretty direct and, frankly, potent, given the circumstances. They argued officers needed masks for their own safety to avoid being identified and targeted by criminals, or worse, by violent extremists. And they explicitly pointed to the Dallas shooting suspect, who authorities believed intended to kill and, quote, terrorize ICE agents.
So it's this clash of fears again. Fear of unaccountable power versus fear of targeted violence.
Exactly. And then layering onto all of this was a major legal development from the Supreme Court just before these events. The court had recently lifted a lower court injunction. This injunction had specifically restricted ICE in the Los Angeles area from stopping someone based only on their ethnicity or the language they spoke.
So that injunction had basically put some limits on profiling, at least in LA.
That's right. It was a legal barrier, however localized, against stopping someone just because they looked like an immigrant. By lifting that injunction, the Supreme Court essentially removed that constraint. It signaled to agents, perhaps implicitly, that those pre-injunction tactics, relying more heavily on appearance or language, were potentially back on the table legally.
Wow. So just as political pressure was mounting to increase deportations, and just after the Dallas attack put agents on high alert, the Supreme Court removes a key legal check on potentially stopping someone like Hilda, who, as the advocate said, might just look like a Latino while driving.
Precisely. That timing is critical. It helps explain the mindset on September 26th. You have agents feeling targeted and needing protection, especially after Dallas. You have residents and advocates feeling they're being targeted based on appearance, even if they're legal residents. And the legal and political environment had shifted to allow, maybe even encourage, more aggressive enforcement tactics. It created this perfect storm that erupted in places like Chelsea, Broadview, and New York. So if we pull it all together, what the sources show us for September 26, 2025, is a snapshot of nationwide immigration enforcement marked by, well, intense public clashes, significant use of force, very rare instances of immediate internal review, like in NYC, and all of this happening under the shadow of increased deportation goals from the top and that very real recent violence against agents in Dallas. It was a day where fear seemed to be driving actions on all sides.
And our goal here, as always, was just to give you that detailed picture, drawing directly from the reporting, so you understand the dynamics and the tensions that boiled over on that specific day. We want you to have the context behind those chaotic headlines. But here's something maybe to think about after listening. We talked about Hilda and Chelsea detained, injured, scared, all while being a legal U.S. resident. She was released, yes, but only after experiencing tactics usually reserved for dangerous criminals. So what does that tell us about the line between legal status and vulnerability when the primary goal seems to be maximizing deportations? If someone could be targeted just for looking like the profile, even if they're legally present, what does that do to the concept of safety and rights within a community? That's something to consider as you reflect on the role federal agencies play locally.